This is the Comics Alternative, episode 252, reviews of Spinning, Love and Rockets Volume 4, Number 3, and Slots, Number 1. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul, and we're two academics talking about comics.
That's right. And on this week's episode, Paul and I are going to look at 3 new titles. We're going to begin with Tillie Walden's new book, Spinning. After that, we're going to look at the 3rd issue of Love and Rockets, Volume 4. And then after that, we're going to wrap up with issue number 1 of Slots by Dan Panosian. But before we get to those books, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by those great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts will be between 20 and 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials, and October is no exception. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off the cover, but every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
That's right. A great a way to take advantage of those bundles those discounts is to check out the bundles that DCB Service has. And in the month of October, you'll be able to find a Young Animal bundle at 50% off. You'll be able to find a Vertigo bundle at 50% off. If you want to find out what the heck is going on in the DC universe with this Doomsday Clock business, there's bundles for that stuff. Marvel Legacy bundles, Valiant bundles, all kinds of bundles. So take advantage of those bundles. In addition, of course, you're going to find all kinds of titles that you can pre-order at Discount Comic Book Service. The titles that we're talking about today include Slots, which the 3rd issue you can find at 40% off at DCBS, and also you can find Love and Rockets Magazine number 4, which is the next issue after the one that we're talking about today, number 3. You can find Love and Rockets Magazine number 4 at 35% off the cover price.
Yeah, those are great discounts, and whether you get your comics bundled or in single issues, you can't go wrong with the great folks at DCB Service. Go to dcbservice.com for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your books there, please be sure to drop them an email and tell them that the 2 guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right. Let them know.
So, Paul, how have you been?
I've been well. Partly buoyed by the great comics reading that I've been able to enjoy, and glad to have you back, Derek. We've missed you. Those of us who I consider myself a fan and listener, as well as an occasional guest here. So it's good to be here.
Yeah, and we should mention that for the past couple of episodes, last week and then this one, Andy Kunka has not been on. He's really occupied with other things going on right now and is not able to co-host. He will be back on later in November, but until then, hey, you're going to be helping me out this week and definitely next week, and who knows, maybe in some of the weeks to come. It depends on your availability, but it's always great to have you on the show and talk about titles, and as we're going to do today.
We got quite a lineup today. And Derek, it's always good to hear your voice and to have your insight about comics. And I'm glad that the listeners have been hanging on and staying tuned. And I think folks are gonna enjoy the titles that we're talking about today, and hopefully a conversation as well.
Well, let's go ahead and start that conversation. We're going to begin with a new book from Tillie Walden, and this is Spinning. This is coming out from First Second, and it was released around the middle of September. So it's been out for a few weeks. One of the things there are a couple of things that's notable about this book. Tillie Walden, we've discussed her a number of times on the Comics Alternative. In fact, I interviewed her about a little more than a year ago when her first book came out, her very first book. So her publisher, one of the things that's notable about Spinning is that she had been published, and maybe she still is going to be published, I don't know, by Avery Hill, which is a publisher out of the UK. Yeah. And so this is her first second book, or her first non-Avery Hill book, as far as I know.
That's right.
But it's notable that this is coming out from first second. Another thing that's notable about Spinning is that it's a memoir, and that's very different from all of the other works that she's come out with. Now, her other books that have come out from Avery Hill, I think, have had autobiographical tints
elements
to it, yes.
Yep.
But they have not been straight-out memoir or autobiography. This is.
That's right. Yeah. To my knowledge, there are no giant cats in Tillie Walden's actual life. That's a reference to some of her previous work. But yeah, End of Summer, and the stories all have a groundedness that make it unsurprising, and they also seem so deeply personal. Right. That there's definitely something that comes very much from the root and heart of Tillie Walden, if you can call it that. But this is definitely her life, right? This is we have young Tillie here.
Yeah, and so I'm glad that you're familiar with some of the other work that Tillie Walden has done, because it has been remarkable, and not just her Avery Hill books, but also her online comics. I know that she did one. The title escapes me, but Sean,
On a Sunbeam, is it?
Yes, and Sean and I discussed it several months ago on our webcomics monthly series.
Yeah,
and it's of a kind with her other works. When you talk about things like giant cats and kind of fantastical elements mixed into the more realistic interpersonal action that goes on. But like you find in, let's say, for instance, The End of Summer, right. Her very first book. But again, this is markedly different because it's just straight out memoir. So you're right, there are no big cats or other kind of like sci-fi-ish or fantastical elements going on here. And the title refers to spinning in terms of ice skating. And that is basically, I guess, the scaffolding around which this memoir is structured. And in fact, the book is divided into 10 chapters, and each chapter is introduced to a particular skating move and what it is and whether or not Tillie has been able to do it successfully, which is, I think, a really clever way of dividing the book, right? Because at the very beginning of the chapter, you get a particular move. Like for instance, I'm going to just look at one, just open it up. Okay, so chapter 5 is the spiral. And she writes, the only hard part of a spiral was finding your momentum. Once you're moving fast enough and your leg was in the air, it felt like you could go on forever. And then on chapter 8, the move counter. A counter is a 1-foot turn where your entry and exit are on opposite curves. A perfect counter makes a very specific mark on the ice. After doing a few, I would always retrace my steps, searching for the perfect cut in the ice. And so all the chapters begin this way. And ice skating is never far from whatever's going on in this narrative. Now, there's much more going on in spinning than just ice skating. And we can talk about those elements, but again, ice skating is front and center.
That's right. Yeah, and I think the word that you used for it, scaffolding, is perfect, because I think that the ice skating structures the narrative in which there's a whole lot of else going on, as you said. And in a way, those little chapter introductions that you mentioned show the ways that she talks about ice skating as it's a discipline, right? And often you have to be very disciplined to do it, but it's also her subjective experience of that discipline, her own, can I pull this off? In chapter 4, talking about the axle in that opening, she says, I've never known a more frustrating jump. And it's sort of her subjective experience of this, very structured and disciplined thing. And I think that's very much what the book does, is there's all these paces that life, adolescence puts you through, especially if you're doing something as intense as competitive figure skating. And there's her in the midst of those paces, trying to figure out herself and trying to have her subjective experience and find its validity. So I think that, it is a brilliant kind of structure to put around the story.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned growing up as an adolescent, because I think that in pairing that with ice skating, because what she goes through with ice skating, or her relationship with ice skating, I think is part and parcel of growing up, because there are a lot of frustrations, there are a lot of successes. There are times when she is just wanting to quit, and there are other times that she gets a lot of satisfaction out of what she does. And so she, I don't want to say she has a love-hate relationship with skating, because I don't think it's hate, but there are times that there are quite a number of frustrations. Now, at the beginning of this book, I guess the first chapter, is it the first chapter that she moves from New Jersey to Austin, Texas?
If it's not the first chapter, it's pretty early in the narrative.
Yeah, it's first or second chapter. And so when she was relatively young, she was ice skating in New Jersey, and her experiences there were much more rigorous. In fact, we got to see the coach of her skating team was kind of like a drill sergeant in the Army. And it didn't seem overly pleasant. But she did learn a lot of discipline. But then when she went to her family moved to Austin, Texas, things were a little different. They weren't as, I guess, nerve-wracking or strict or militaristic, if we want to put it that way. And we get to see her and her uncertainties in meeting new people. But she eventually makes quite a number of friends. I think one of the most prominent of which is an older woman or girl by the name of Lindsay, who, once she becomes friends with Lindsay becomes, I guess, a reliable companion, a friend throughout the remainder of the text. And there are times that we see Lindsay quite a bit, and there are other times that Lindsay fades into the background, but she's always there. So, once Tillie becomes close to Lindsay, Lindsay becomes not really a mother figure, but she's someone who does take care and befriends and comforts Tillie when she needs it. So, that's one of the connections that she makes there.
That's right. Yeah, she is a major character, and you're right. In the end of the first chapter, she finds out that they're moving to Texas. But in that first chapter, we do find out about the rigorous discipline of her very military style coach, and that's contrasted with Caitlin, her later coach in Texas, who is much more relational and sort of looser in those rigors, but becomes also a kind of a figure of nurturance and care for Tillie. And we also see the contrast between this friend Lindsay, that you were mentioning, who becomes an ongoing presence for her, and a friend that she had in New Jersey, Molly, who, when I first read it, I could have sworn they were sisters, the way that they were bickering, But it seems that she was just that friend, that friend you're so close to that you fight with all the time. And she later reflects on feeling a sense of loss, actually, as she adjusts to the pace and the sort of attitude of being in Texas and those around her, that she kind of misses that rigid discipline and that sort of contentiousness that Molly and her coach, her old coach, provided her. In a way, Texas gives, sort of loosens up and gives her lots of space to grow and figure herself out. And that can be nerve-wracking. And you sense a little bit of that as she's figuring herself out in this new terrain.
That's right. And one of the things that, I was going to mention like a major relationship she has later on in the book. But before I do that, you were talking about coaches, and I wanted to mention another coach that we never see directly. We only see a couple of times in flashback, and this is Barbara.
Yes.
It struck me after reading this book and thinking about it that Barbara plays a more prominent role than you would think, given the limited number of times that she's referenced or we see her in flashback. Right. Barbara was Tillie's very first ice skating coach.
Yes.
And from the way that Tillie describes her, she's someone who is very maternal, She's very caring, and she's someone that Tillie longs for. In fact, she wonders at one point, I think toward the end of the book, if maybe her staying in ice skating is and going to competitions is her way of unconsciously hoping that she will eventually see Barbara again.
Right.
And so this seems to be like a mother figure that she's longing for, that she's wanting again, because her actual mother, I mean, we see her a few times in the book, but she seems to be a very hands-off mother.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, of her two parents, the father's the one who seems to be there for her much more frequently. But the mother seems to be not necessarily standoffish, but absent.
Right. Yeah. She'll mention often other skaters as parents, expected to be at the competitions, and she didn't necessarily expect that,
Right.
She had just gotten used to that. They may not show up. Yeah.
Yeah. And so bringing this back to that first coach, Barbara, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why Barbara is almost like a ghost figure over the text, right? I mean, she's someone who haunts, but in a good way, Tillie, because she's someone that, Tillie longs for, like a mother figure.
Yeah. There is a sense that is throughout the text that there's almost an empty space. There's like a big sense of like a vacant and unfilled something that she's searching for. The one of the earliest scenes is her waking up in the dark, for figure skaters who have to get up, before the crack of dawn and make it to the rink early to practice. And there's so much use of negative space in the art that one is a Tillie Walden specialty, but two, just really gives a sense of like, of what it must be like to step into a rink and to be the first one or the only one there, before most people are out of bed, and how everything is sort of an open space, but also almost silent, like waiting, like you're waiting, you're longing for it to be filled with something. And there's not the sort of abiding presence of a parent the way that my daughter experiences the abiding presence of her helicopter father. I just feel like Tillie's account of her experience is one where it's a lot of, sort of not emptiness is not quite the word, but space waiting to be filled with something, with nurturance, with whatever needs to figure out to become. I don't know if that was too abstract.
No. You're right. I mean, there does seem to be something throughout the text, this sense that there's something that needs to be filled for Tillie. And but in many ways, I think that's part of a growing up narrative, right?
Yes.
An adolescent, unsure of herself, and trying to wonder, how do I fit in? Where am I going? What do I want? And one of the things that drives her, and thus drives the narrative in this memoir, is, what is she going to use to fill that space, or what is it that she's searching for? So, at times it could be Barbara, at times it could be competition, at times it could also be affection. Something that we haven't mentioned yet is a very special friend of hers, Ray. And this is a story not only about skating, not only about growing up, but also it's a story about coming out. Because Tillie in this memoir tells us that she realized when she was younger that she was gay. And so she is friends in Texas with a young girl named Ray. And at one point, Ray stays the night over at Tillie's house. I think they're in a garage bedroom or something. And they end up kissing. And, Tillie realizes that, I am falling for Ray and I am gay. And so it's about her coming out as well. And we see as the story unfolds that there are, as you would expect, complications that go on with this.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and also a process for Tillie of coming out to her family as well, as a teenager,
right?
Partly resulting from this relationship, and there's some really poignant and beautiful moments between them. There's a page 163 where they're just they're playing and they're looking at each other, and there's a huge expanse of sky above them, and you sort of imaginatively feel that with lots of that affection of young love,
Mm-hmm. Right.
And then there's moments that are heartbreaking with, as you said, the kind of constraints and the kind of pressures that can come with non-hospitable family members and people in the community.
Right. And it's not just the anxiety of coming out to your family. I think even more the anxiety of coming out to her schoolmates and the young girls who are with her on the skating team, because she's very anxious about that. It's one thing to come out to your family. It's another thing to come out to people that you're not related to. And so she doesn't want to have to do that. But she knows, because of some complications that go on with Ray, we don't want to give anything away, because we definitely want people to read this book.
Yeah,
but but yeah, I mean, she is in many ways forced to come out to these people, and that's tough.
Right. Yeah.
So this is again a story, among other things, of coming out.
Yeah. And I think, to me, tonally, that whole experience and process for her seemed, again, of such a piece with her feelings about ice skating. As you were saying, figure skating represents for her a place of joy and a way that she can sort of find herself, express herself. And then it's this thing that she's like bumping her head against, like I gotta keep doing this, and I'm so tired of it. And it's a commitment that moves past the point of, just desire and motivation to the point of identity, to the point of, this is who I am, and my relationship to it is a way of sorting out myself and who I am. And I think the same is going on with her sexuality as well, not in the sense of bumping up against it, but bumping up against who she is publicly and how people perceive her, and how she has to reckon with that. And again, as you said, like, a lot of this is the stuff of adolescence, but I think the particular categories that Tillie's doing that with the skating, with her family, with life in Texas, and then with her relationships such as Ray. I don't know. As you said, I think we both recommend this, right? This was super compelling. I mean, I couldn't put this book down.
Yeah, and it's long. In fact, it is 392 pages long.
Yeah,
If you don't count the author's note.
Right.
Yeah, and it's quite a thick book, but I have to tell you, it is compelling. I read it. It was almost over a 24-hour period. It was about maybe a day and a half, a day and a quarter, which kind of surprised me. But once I got into the book, I just had to continue with it and, not put it down. I slept, but, taking those kind of, and ate, but, outside of taking those breaks, I read it straight through.
Yeah. I mean, I liked The End of Summer a lot. And I read a lot of On a Sunbeam too. But I think The End of Summer took me until the end of the summer. I think it took me a little while to read. It wasn't as propulsive as this work was for me. And so I felt like The End of Summer was beautiful, was intriguing, but it felt a little bit like, I don't want to say this, this is more insulting than I mean it to be. It felt a little bit like work, like I had to put in work to understand that book. This one, on the other hand, was just so relatable for me. And so I was totally gripped. And I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I did too. Great book.
Yeah.
Now let me ask you something. Now, when you and I were discussing what possible titles to look at this week, you had mentioned that Gwen had said something about spinning, and you wondered if maybe she wanted to discuss this on the Young Reader show that you do with her. And I had gotten in touch with her to make sure that she wasn't adamant about that, and she said, "Oh, you guys go ahead and talk about it on the regular review show," which I'm glad, because I really wanted to discuss this.
Right.
But let me ask you: do you think that this is a book for younger readers or not?
That's a great question. I think that it could be a book that younger readers not only would enjoy, but might, in many respects, need. Of course, a lot of that comes down to the definition of younger, which is something that we've talked about, and I may have introduced a certain element of pushing that envelope, since I am a teacher of adolescents. I work in secondary English, and so I'm often thinking about your 13 to 15-year-olds when I think of younger readers, in addition to, of course, readers like my daughter who are 6 years old, 7 years old. But I think that one, that the story is a gay teen being able to sort of think through and talk about her experiences of coming out, and the fact that these kinds of experiences of doing something like figure skating and also the interactions with other skaters and friends and those sorts of things, I think they would lend themselves really well to just connecting with a teenage reader. I could picture that. I also think that some of this had, different kinds of personal significance for Gwen too. And so I'm glad that you and I get to talk about it for sure. I know that Gwen, is supportive of us talking about it. So, but I do think that it's something that I'm glad we're talking about on the main review show. I would recommend this to some teenagers looking for this kind of work. Yeah.
I agree with you 100%. I think that, overall, my sense of things after having read the book was that this is something for, let's say, a general readership, but I definitely think it's something that an older adolescent can benefit from, and maybe identify with in a variety of ways. So, so I think in that sense, it could fit into the young reader show that you and Gwen do. But like you, I'm glad that we're doing this on the regular review show.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. And also, again, it's markedly different from many of the other books that she does, like, The End of Summer, On a Sunbeam, and another shorter work of hers, I Love This Part.
Yes.
Which, along with The End of Summer, was nominated last year for an Ignatz Award. Yeah. And in fact, I can tell you, last year, I didn't attend this year, unfortunately, but last year when I attended SPX, I did go to the Ignatz Award ceremony, and whenever Tillie Walden's name was mentioned, and it was mentioned 2 or 3 times just because of these 2 nominations, a lot of applause, a lot of cheer. She is, and she wasn't there at SPX. She is much loved. This is a young writer. I think she's probably 21 now, because when I interviewed her 2 years, well, no, she may be just 20, because when I interviewed her last year, she was 19.
Okay. I think I saw somewhere that she's 21, but close, right? Okay. Around there.
So she may be 21 and can legally drink, but if she wanted to. But yeah, she is a young talent, and I think yes, The End of Summer. Yes, I Love This Part. Okay, we get to see some of her early work. I think, though, with Spinning, we're seeing a much more, how shall I put it, developed and mature comics artist. And nonetheless, I think that as advanced as Spinning is from the earlier books, I think this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Absolutely.
We haven't seen, as they say, you ain't seen nothing yet.
I think that's the most startling thing, that she's already had this much of an output. And I know every time Tillie Walden gets talked about, there's always a mention of her age, but she is a phenom, and sorry, LeBron James, when he came on the scene, everybody was talking about him being 18 years old and an absolute, wonderkin. And I think you can't help but, there's parts in this book where she is a, young teenager, and she and her friends are talking about reading Twilight. And those are the little wake up call moments for you or for me when I'm like, wow, she was born in 1996, as it says, and that's mind blowing to me. But she's, I think that the maturity is there in her early work, which is why she's such a phenom, why her work is so remarkable. You can see this sense of pace and proportion and this fineness in her line work, and the way that she is able to emote with characters and also utilize architectures. That is just like, I can't believe that this creator, this artist, is so young, and yet so many. You're right. This is, I think, the first full blown work, but you could see so much of this, and even I love this part, is this sort of poetic capsule version of what goes on in the relationship between Ray and her in this book. And it's so, I feel like LeBron James finally got to get on the court, so to speak. Not that her Avery Hill books weren't the big leagues, but I feel like this work gave her the space to do just to do some full tilt Tillie Walden, and I can't wait to see more that she's going to produce. Yeah,
exactly. It's like those. You're right. I don't want to short shrift the earlier Avery Hill books, but they strike me now, having read Tillie, having read Spinning, as prologue.
Yeah, yeah. There's so much in those books that is going on in the silence and in the spaces and in the relationship dynamics between characters that she can really play up here in Spinning wonderfully well.
Yeah. I do think that this next move of hers after those Avery Hill books, this memoir, made sense. Where I would like to see her go after this, and of course this is me and my interests. She could say, I don't want to do that. I don't care what Derek says. Sure. I'd like to see her take on another fictional narrative, but anchor it much less in her own life. I'm not saying that it has to be something like sci-fi or fantasy or something like that, but to deal with a fictionalized narrative that is in many ways divorced from her own experiences. So I'd like to see her hand in that, because even those Avery Hill books, as we've mentioned, have some elements of autobiography in them, and you can tell that now, having read Spinning. Yeah, I'd like to see her try something quite a bit different from memoir.
Yeah, I would be really into that too. And at the same time, I think one of the things that I thought about with this book is whether it is comparable to other, they're not necessarily debuts, but maybe like when certain creators made a big splash by doing something powerful and memoirish. I wonder if anybody comes to mind who's a good comparison for you in the annals of graphic novels who, done this coming of age narrative really well.
I have to tell you, when I read Spinning, I couldn't help but think of Craig Thompson's Blankets.
Yeah. Similarly, coming of age, pretty epic in scope and yet very intimate in reflection. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. Well, that book was groundbreaking, and I wonder if this too will. I don't know what the new ground is that is being broken, since really good memoirs are sort of gushing out from the graduating classes of SVA and CCS and stuff like that. But this does seem like something that the comics making community can stand up and cheer for.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Paul, you want to move on to the next title that we're going to be looking at this week?
That sounds good.
Yeah, and this is Love and Rockets, Volume 4, magazine size, issue number 3. This is coming out, of course, from Fantagraphics, and this came out in early August. So it's been a while, but again, we haven't been putting out podcasts until, we took a brief hiatus, but we never want to miss an issue of Love and Rockets, and so we just had to talk about this. So now we're 3 issues into the new magazine-sized series. And let me ask you, Paul, have you been keeping up with this new series, and had you been a regular Love and Rockets reader even before that?
Yeah, that reminds me that I just had this stunning moment of realizing that I'm talking to Derek Parker Royal about Love and Rockets, which is a bit of a I'm swooning. This is so cool. Just because I've appreciated your scholarship about the Hernandez brothers' work and stuff like that. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear. There's fighter jets flying outside my window. Yeah, my history with Love and Rockets. I guess I came to them relatively late. Though for reasons that make sense. I was in college at Berkeley around the new millennium, and I actually I'd heard about Love and Rockets throughout my comics adolescence, but it actually started with the Big Palomar volume. Picked that up from a bookstore when I was in college, and I read that big chunk, and I'm really glad that I kind of was initiated that way, because I think if I had read it a piece here and a fragment there, it would have been really hard for me to get a sense of the sort of collective memory that drives this book. But having read Palomar, that mega volume, which I
Right.
still have to this day, so since New Stories, basically, I've been keeping up with both sides. I shouldn't say both, of course. We don't mean to leave out Mario, but and actually, initially, I was much more of a Gilbert, and Jaime was sort of like, just definitely didn't vibe as much with it. But these days, I'm actually vibing way more with Jaime. Although I really love Marvel season and Julio's Day and stuff like that. So I do keep up with both. And yes, I have been keeping up with Volume 4 as they've been coming out.
Yeah. Well, let me say that I have a similar experience as you do in terms of the Gilbert Jaime preference. When I first came to Love and Rockets, I think my affection was more with Gilbert's work, especially the Palomar stories. But I have to tell you that over the past several years, especially since the new story annuals that had come out, basically Love and Rockets Volume 3,
right,
I have grown closer and feel more resonant with Jaime's stories than with Gilbert's, and I think because Gilbert's, I guess the reason is twofold. At times, his stories can get really wild and out there, and I have nothing against that. I tend to appreciate the more realistic narratives in comics. I mean, and not just in terms of the Hernandez brothers, but in general, right? So, I'll take a realistic narrative, whether it be, fictional or autobiographical, over a sci-fi narrative almost any day, or fantasy narrative. Right. That's just my taste. Another thing, though, that Gilbert does that doesn't drive me away, but makes me, I think, prefer Jaime stories more, is that especially with Fritz, it becomes so convoluted, and the narrative and the characters become so tangled. Yes. And Andy and I have commented a number of times of how confusing the Fritz wannabes can get. And so, how can you distinguish between Tatiki and Baby and all the other characters who are Fritz wannabes? So, I mean, by this point, I can pretty much distinguish them. But about a year or two ago, it's like, what the hell is going on? And who are all these characters? But, as frustrating as that can be, I do have to say that Gilbert's Fritz stories are more ambitious than what Jaime is doing, although I tend to enjoy Jaime's stories more. Yet when I really think about Gilbert's stories, I get to appreciate them more. So I think that with Gilbert's stories, especially the Fritz stuff, it takes time, it takes patience, and it takes some digging. In other words, it takes more effort than, I think, an appreciation of Jaime's work. That's not to suggest that Jaime's narratives are simple by any means. I think they're very complex, and there's a lot going on there. But yeah, I mean, I love both brothers, and this is a great issue. Now, the way that it's structured is that it starts off with a Jaime story where you basically have, and I really appreciated this. We have a story of Maggie as a teenager. So we have Maggie in 1979, and this lasts for just a few pages. Then we have a relatively short installment of the Princess Anima storyline. And the Princess Anima storyline has, I think, last issue, it dovetailed with the Ilsa story that we had seen in, I think, originally in New Stories in the annual. And so now we have those two stories melding together. So we have just a few pages, relatively short installment of Princess Anima, Lumina, and Ilsa. And then we have another short piece by Jaime. So he has those first three stories where we have a young Hopey. And I'm assuming that this takes place in 1979 as well. It doesn't indicate this, but we do see Izzy in both the Maggie 1979 story and the younger Hopey story, and she looks the same, so I'm assuming that the Hopey story takes place in 79. Then we get the first Gilbert installment, and this is primarily about the television program Professor Enigma and Missy, which is kind of a knockoff of Doctor Who. And this is a longer piece. And then we have another Jaime piece, and this is a continuation of the Huerta punk reunion that started back in the New Story volumes, which I'm really enjoying. Which is basically Maggie and Hopey and their friends in present day, right? They get together back in Hoppers for a punk reunion, and part of it is seeing the old bands. But the majority of it is getting together with their old friends, and especially the relationship between Maggie and Hopey. And then and this issue ends with another Gilbert piece that I think I'm assuming is titled "You Can't Get a False Positive 2.0," because that's what's on the first page. And so this is basically, in some ways, a continuation of what we saw in the Professor Enigma and Missy section, where we have Fritz and her daughters and other people who've been a part of this program, Dr. Enigma, and their relationship. So, I mean, it's a pretty good balance. And I don't know about you, but the part that, and I've alluded to this a moment ago, the parts of this issue that I was particularly interested in were seeing Maggie and Hopey as they were younger. And I'm wondering if Jaime is going to be doing more of this, because I mean, he can definitely move forward with the Princess Anima story, but when it comes to Maggie and Hopey, we have the reunion, and there's a lot that can be done here, right? I mean, Maggie is going to go back, and we see in this issue that Maggie's even contemplating marrying Ray, and so there's a lot that can develop there, But if you're Jaime and you're wondering, okay, where can I take Maggie and Hopey? I mean, he can definitely continue on with this reunion and Maggie's relationship with not only Hopey, but especially with Ray. Ray's one of my favorite characters. I'd like to see more of him. But maybe another direction for him to go is backwards. In other words, show us more a younger teenage Maggie and a teenage Hopey and what they went through and how... Because, we haven't had that in previous Love and Rockets issues. I don't think we've ever, to my memory, seen a younger teenage Maggie and Hopey.
No, I mean, in some ways what I think he's taking the opportunity to do is to write the story that forms in his head about these characters as sort of prehistory before Love and Rockets, because when it started, it was Maggie and the Mechanics, and we had a very different kind of world and even expectations about what the story was doing that eventually became, it didn't shed all those elements of what made, the sort of sci-fi and the, what's his name, race, so on, all that stuff hasn't disappeared. It's found a place, but what became a very like Hopey Maggie story didn't get that origin or that backstory, or this is what it was like in 1979, because those weren't sort of at the forefront of the concerns of the story at that time. It becomes obviously the center of the locas work, and I loved that those were put together in this issue. I mean, I've enjoyed the reunion as well, but to have this look at Hopey and Maggie now, and then to have these really very flashback kind of sequences, and to be reminded in a sense of who they were, or who, their allusions to their past said that they were when they were, young adults or late adolescents or whatever. It's just so good because Love and Rockets is now all about this whole tapestry of 30 some odd years of storytelling and all this memory that you have when you've gotten to know these characters and watch them age, and to have that brought together, in an issue is, it just pulls my heartstrings. And it's what I love about this book. The fact that I lugged that giant volume of, whether it was Palomar or Luba or, those collections around, and spent so much time with these characters. It's just like a beautiful reconnection with the past and present of these characters.
Right. Now regarding these 1979 short pieces that we have in this issue, it reminds me of something that Gilbert did several years ago. He had a 3-issue series through Fantagraphics, larger format comics called New Tales of Old Palomar, and it was later collected as Children of Palomar. And so basically what Gilbert did was to take his Palomar characters back quite a number of years to see how they were when they were younger. So some of the people, let's say like People, were little kids, and then others like Cello were still adults, but younger adults.
Right.
So now Jaime is doing something like this in this issue with these 2 shorter works that take place in 1979. And I hope we get more of this, as long as it doesn't turn into something too cute like Lil Maggie and Lil Hopey, which I know it won't, but I would like to see more of this. And another thing that interested me about these stories is to see a younger Izzy.
Yeah.
Because now, and we saw Izzy in this reunion piece, and I was wondering when Izzy was coming into this reunion story. We do get to see her in this issue, and this is the Izzy that we have, I think, now kind of grown into. Someone who is a little off balance, someone who is enigmatic.
Haunted.
Yes, haunted. Yeah. That's a great way of putting it. Yeah. But the Izzy that we see in these 2 short pieces that take place in 1979, she's someone who is much more attuned to what's going on around her. Yeah. She is, in some ways, kind of a maternal figure, taking care of Maggie and Hopey. This is the Izzy, and I think this takes place before Flies on the Ceiling. And in that story, Flies on the Ceiling, that seems to have been the starting point that messed Izzy up. And so this is an Izzy before the Flies on the Ceiling story. So she's a very different person than she is now today.
Right.
Whereas, as you put it, haunted.
Yeah. And that, again, that's part of the sort of resonance of our memory of these stories that makes this hit so hard. In the latter scene when they're sitting around at the diner and chatting, I forgot what the diner's called. But she has this worn, you're right. It's the Izzy that we've come to know. And there's this sort of weathered and worn expression on her face.
Right. Where
she has been so maternal to these characters for so long, and you can just see the years of having all the loss that she's experienced and so on.
And she's frowning a lot.
Yeah. And on those simple lines of Jaime is so good at beautiful and powerful simple lines, but on those simple lines in her face, there's just so much history. And to be taken back at the 1979 narratives at the beginning, and to remember what a burden carrier she's always been for these characters, what a sort of like you said, the mature presence who sort of is there to talk sense, bail them out, and then to be wounded by that doing that for others is very, very poignant. Yeah.
So I hope we get more of these stories in future issues of young Maggie and young Hopey.
Yeah, I do too. I imagine that the Anima stuff is also going to come around. I have to be honest, I tune out a lot of times when it's those things, and I felt the same about the Professor Enigma. Whenever they're in the story worlds of, whether it's Fritz's TV shows or things that are going on that are more imaginative, I always have to almost remind myself to pay attention, because I'm a little bit like you in the way you described yourself, Derek, that I tend to like the grounded in reality stuff. I liked Palomar. Once we got to California and everything went all Hollywood, I just started to zone out a little bit, and only through attentively thinking about it that I was like, oh, actually this is, this is a little weirder for me, but it's part of it's part of what they're trying to do. There's reasons why we're going here, and so I'm still a little puzzled about how this all fits together. But that's the way I felt about like the Thai girls and all that stuff, and eventually it did really, it did really feel like an essential part of the story. So it's just some patience I need as a reader.
Yeah, that's the way. That's the way that I look at the Princess Anima storyline. Is that it is Jaime's way of doing what he did with the Thai girls, and in fact, Princess Anima, in many ways, visually, is reminiscent of Penny Century.
Right. Yes.
And in fact, speaking of Penny, it's interesting that in this installment of the punk reunion, where you mentioned they're sitting around together in a diner, Daphne, Maggie, Hopey, I think Daphne's daughter, and Izzy, and maybe one other person, I can't remember. The guitar player from Hopey's band, I can't remember her name.
Right, yeah.
But they're sitting around talking, and they're saying, we got about everyone here. All we need now is Penny Century.
Penny.
and then Daphne's daughter, who doesn't know Penny, said, "Who's Penny Century?"
Right.
And they responded. How do they describe her? Say she's I got to look this up.
Yeah,
because I thought that was really interesting how they describe her. Oh, I got to find this now.
Yeah,
the
only one missing
Century? Is a cross between Helen of Troy and Minnie Pearl. And I guess that does in many ways describe Penny Century. I have to tell you, I miss Penny.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's why it's so great that we have those collections to go back to. But for sure. Because, I mean, and in the panel, right? I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and the reason I do miss her is because Penny was, how do I put this? She was kind of like a safety valve for the Maggie and Hopey, or the locas storyline, in that Penny was the means for Jaime to get all fantasy or science fiction, right? Within that storyline. And you get rid of Penny Century, and you're left with, let's say, a more realistic locas narrative. And so if he wants to do anything that is much more sci-fi or fantastical, then he has to do it with another story like the Princess Anima.
Yeah, narrative. Sure, she keeps the rockets in the love and rockets.
Exactly. That's a good way of putting it, yeah. So what were you going to say?
No, it was just that very panel, or actually the one right before. I thought the conversation was full of rich meaning. Hopey says, well, look at us. The only one missing is Penny Century. Don't jinx it. Looks like you're her stand-in, Jessica. Who is Penny Century? Well, now, where does one begin? How does one begin? A cross between Helen of Troy and Minnie Pearl. She's an old friend, Jess. And just so these particular characters who range between the sort of old and new, right? Sitting around at the diner, it's almost like a check-in moment for all of us, I mean, I'm sure there's folks who are starting to read Love and Rockets who've like stuck with it starting from volume 4 and read the first 3 issues and are like, okay, I'm getting into this. Who are all these people? And there's others who there's sort of new to the table in some sense. And then there's others who, of course, have been around since 1982 or whatever. And I mean, I feel like Love and Rockets has always been as welcoming and unwelcoming as any comics, welcoming in the sense that there's always something that you can attach to, whether you are more of a Penny person or a Hopey person or a Maggie person. Right. But there's always this like extensive back history that even if you've been following the whole time, you're just trying to piece it together, piece together whatever's in Jaime's head or in Gilbert's head. And so the sitting around the table trying to piece together this almost mythology of these people they know, is very much like the reader's experience, I think. Yeah.
And, what you're saying reminds me of a question. I asked you earlier if you were familiar with Love and Rockets before this latest volume, the magazine size. And, of course, you knew the storylines. And so, basically you can pick up issue number 3 of this 4th volume and understand what's going on. A question I have is something that you alluded to a moment ago, that if readers new to Love and Rockets begin with, let's say, issue 1 of this 4th volume, the magazine size, will they be able to get it In other words, will they understand
Right.
what's going on? And it's interesting. Last week when I was recording the preview show with Gene, we had mentioned that, issue number 4 of Love and Rockets was solicited. And Gene mentioned that he really hasn't read Love and Rockets. And it got me thinking, could he pick up, let's say, issue 1 of this new magazine size series and understand what's going on? And I think it would be difficult for a new reader to start with issue 1 of this new series for a couple of reasons. Right. One, the whole backstory of what's going on, and not just with Jaime's story world with Locas, but with Gilbert's and Palomar and Fritz and all of that, especially with Fritz, right? It's like, I can imagine someone picking up, Love and Rockets Volume 4 and reading the first 3 issues and trying to make sense of the Fritz storyline and their head exploding. Or them becoming, drooling, babbling idiots.
Right.
But also the transition from the new story series, the annuals, into this new magazine size volume was basically seamless, right? So what we're discussing now, the reunion story, Princess Anima, the Fritz storyline, Baby, and all of that. All of this basically started with deep into the new story series, the annuals, and just, seamlessly transitioned into the magazine size stories. So I think for those 2 reasons, the whole back history of Love and Rockets with both Jaime and Gilbert stories, but also the stories that have just basically continued from the new story series, it'd be difficult for a new reader to approach Love and Rockets starting with just volume 4.
I think you're completely right, especially when I think about what is satisfying about reading this for me. And, part of it is the things that are new, such as seeing them being preoccupied with cell phones or social media, like that is new, right?
Right.
But most of it is the resonances of the old, is the echoes of stuff that, just knowing that with everything that is happening with, no, actually, I don't want to give it away, but the ending of Gilbert's work and where they wind up, where the 2 daughters wind up, well, I might as well just say it. Should I just say it? They wind up with Luba, and so every time Luba reappears, there's a grounding for me in this deep, rich history, right? And so I thought the same thing. I thought, if I'm trying to convince, which I'm always trying to convince people I know and care about to read certain comics, would I say, here's my giant pile of Fantagraphics reprints of, Maggie the Mechanic and so on, or would I just say start with volume 4 or start with the new stories? But whenever I think that they can't start with volume 4 or they can't start with new stories, I remember how disoriented I felt reading Heartbreak Soup initially, or how disoriented I felt reading Maggie the Mechanic. And it makes me think maybe there's almost like you're going to be disoriented to some extent, and there's a way where there's a recursive returning to these various moments in their history and various kinds of relationships that, you're no matter where you enter, it's going to be a little bit, it was vast from the moment we started, and it's remained vast throughout. And so I don't know that I would necessarily warn somebody, to me, it all has to do with access. But, if volume 4 is where you can start, jump in, and wherever you jump in, it's going to be a little bit, it's going to be a lot of swimming to catch up, but it's worth it. That is what I would say,
Yeah. When people have asked me, I want to read Love and Rockets, where do I begin? I tell them, pick up those books, the Love and Rockets library, those really nice new volumes they began putting out several years ago. Right. They have packaged Love and Rockets in a variety of different ways. You mentioned earlier that big Palomar book, which I think is wonderful. And Jaime's done the same thing with 2 volumes, because there are 2 volumes of the Palomar stories, or the Luba stories. There's Palomar and then there's Luba. And then there are also 2 volumes of the Locas stories in these nice hardcover editions. Right. But I think these paperback Love and Rockets library books are just wonderful because they're affordable. There's a lot of material in there. And it's also a good way of reading both Jaime and Gilbert chronologically. And I think that's the best way of doing this, because if you start with, let's say, volume 3 with the annuals, or volume 4 with the magazine, which started last year, you're going to be lost. And in fact, a couple of times in either interviews or in talking with Gilbert, like we went out to dinner with him and his family at HeroesCon, I've asked him 2 or 3 times about readers who are new to Love and Rockets, who may feel a barrier of entry. And, he understands that, but he says, if you can't get on board, then, it may not be for you. So basically, he's writing for those readers who have been with him and his brother, if not from the beginning, then people who know the work from the beginning. Yeah. Because, I'm not someone who began reading Love and Rockets, let's say, in 1983. I came to them a little later. I really didn't read many comics when I was in undergraduate school, and then even in graduate school. And so I had to play catch up, but I played with the Hernandez brothers. I played catch up with a vengeance. There are a lot of people who, just wonder, where do I start? And I think if you're not willing to go back to the beginning, either Maggie and the Mechanics or the Girl from Hoppers, or, and with Gilbert the Palomar stories, then you're going to be lost.
Yeah, that's true. I think that's true. Or you're going to lose a lot of the richness of the stuff.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank goodness and Fantagraphics for those library editions, those collections. Yeah.
Now, something you mentioned a moment ago about how Gilbert's second story ends when both Rosario and Baby are together. And for those who aren't keeping up with the latest Love and Rocket stuff, Rosario is Baby's twin that Baby didn't know that she had until recently. And Baby is Fritz's daughter, who is also in film, but she's in pornographic films for the most part. She's even played her mother, Fritz, in a pornographic film, which is interesting because Fritz, as an actress, has played her mother in the Maria M books. Well, actually, we only have one Maria M book, and I think later, I don't know if it's later this year or early into next year, we're going to get the complete Maria M, from what Gilbert tells me. So anyway, that's who these two characters are, but we see them on the very last pages talking with their grandmother, Luba. And what's notable about it is not only the presence of Luba, because we don't see her often, but in the very last panel, when we see that silhouette of Baby and Rosario walking away, there's also a note, next, a Palomar story. Yeah. So that got me excited. So I guess with issue 4 of Love and Rockets, this new series, we're going to go back to Palomar, which is great. I think the very first time I interviewed Gilbert, and that was 2007, because I've interviewed him a few times. He said that he was probably not going to go back to Palomar, but then he ended up going back to Palomar every now and again. So apparently he had a change of heart. So this is another trip back to Palomar. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
One of my favorite things, one of the many things that I like about Love and Rockets is touching base with Palomar and watching how this sort of global movement and migration has these characters touching back, quote unquote home in some sense, touching base with that world that we spent so much time in.
Yeah. And a few years back, I guess in the New Story annual series, we went back to Palomar, or at least Killer went to Palomar. So we got to see Palomar because Killer wanted to see where her grandmother grew up and what made her grandmother her grandmother.
Yeah.
So, yeah. One other thing before we leave Love and Rockets, every time a new issue of Love and Rockets comes out, whether it be like from several years ago, the annual, to now the magazine size that comes out more frequently, but we don't have as much story material in each issue. I have to go back and refresh myself on what happened in the previous issues. Yeah. And I don't know how you read Love and Rockets Volume 4, Number 3. But what I decided to do was just to read issue number 3, without going back to look at the previous 2 issues. And then after I finished issue 3, I went back to reread issues 1 and 2. And so, there were some things that I had forgotten, some things I hadn't, but I find that necessary with Love and Rockets because of these continuing storylines. I always have to go back to, 2 or 3 issues and refresh myself on what's going on so that I can understand more fully what's going on with the current issue.
Yeah, one of the things that drove me crazy about the news stories was I picked up some of them, the book, the physical copy, and then there were a few that I bought on various apps, like the Sequential app or Comixology, when they came to Comixology, and so I had them scattered all over the place, and they came out so rarely that I was really frustrated having to dig up. And actually, in some cases, I have two copies of them because I didn't even realize that I had gotten them, And so so for 1, 2, and 3 here in Volume 4, I haven't gone back to reread until I was preparing a little bit for this discussion. But I've been just reading them as they come out, which is so great. I mean, they've been quarterly. Is that about right? The release schedule, a little bit more than quarterly, and that's actually just right for me. Mostly because I do have like a lot of schema to place these stories in, like a lot of history with these characters now that I have been kind of tracking how it's going. And so I like this schedule. I like this release schedule. I mean, I don't know how much of how much it's stressing out the brothers to maintain the schedule, if it is or it isn't stressing them out. But man, if they could keep it this way, I'm a happy reader because. Yeah. Well,
from talking with them at Heroes Con and especially interviewing Gilbert, this seems to be better for them. The annual, which at first seemed like a good idea, became a burden for both of them. And they just felt that it was a little too much for them to produce that much material at one time. And so spreading it out as they have, I think, is much more doable.
Absolutely. And let me take the chance to plug your panel conversation with the brothers at Heroes Con. Heroes Con? Yeah. Where I think they talked about exactly that. That was a great conversation, Derek, that you did with them. That was really fun.
Yeah. In fact, if our listeners wanted to hear that panel where Andy Kunka and I had a conversation with Gilbert and Jaime in front of an audience, they can go to the website comicsalternative.com, and I think we put this out in July.
Yeah, I think it's about a month after the show.
Yeah. So that was a fun conversation.
Yeah. Go Comics Alternative.
Well, Paul, let's get to the very last title that we're looking at for this week, and that is Slots, issue number 1, and this is both written and drawn by Dan Panosian. And this came out actually this past Wednesday, or at least Wednesday of last week, October 4th. So it's the most recent title of the 3 that we're looking at this week. Now, were you familiar with Dan Panosian before Slots?
I'm a tiny bit embarrassed to admit, yes, because he had done a lot of embarrassed only because it's not stuff that I read much, but I read enough to know Dan Panosian from the sort of like Witchblade Cyber something or other stuff from a long time ago. In other words, yes, I had known Dan Panosian, but I didn't know this Dan Panosian because I think this is very different from the style of a lot of his previous work. Not entirely different. It's recognizably his art style, but just the genre is quite different from what I had known of his work before. Yeah,
well, doesn't he say in this one-page write-up that is at the end of this issue that he was primarily working as a colorist?
Yeah, although I think he's been the main artist. I think he's actually done different comic book art as penciler and inker for the most part. Okay. He's also done animated work, which you can see a little bit of that, sort of like contemporary animation style in his art. But no, his bibliography is a lot of Image and Marvel stuff. I mean, we're talking about your Cyberforce and your Wolverines and things like that.
See, so I guess that's why I wasn't familiar with him, because I don't read that stuff. Again, not because I don't like it; it's just I don't have the time. So this is, I guess, my first exposure to Dan Panosian, and I have to tell you, I'm quite impressed.
Yeah. I thought it was visually a stunning book.
Oh yes, visually, definitely. Now, if you had to describe this first issue of Slots to the uninitiated, how would you do so?
I would say it's a James Cain novel. It's a Robert Mitchum movie, filtered through a lot of really good nostalgia illustration and design that is very cool looking now. It's a sort of a Darwin Cook's Parker stuff, but maybe updated for what is it now, 10, 15 years since that stuff first came out. Yeah, updated for some of what folks do now to create that nostalgia effect of the 60s and stuff. That's probably how I'd tell it.
Yeah, although I don't think that Stanley Dance, our protagonist, is as smooth and as, let's say, competent or capable as Parker.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. Yeah. Parker's unstoppable.
Yeah, that's right. So the protagonist of Slots is a guy by the name of Stanley Dance, and that's an interesting name.
Yeah.
And he's someone who, I don't know, how would you describe him? He is not really a con man, but he's someone who knows how to get things done.
Yeah.
And, whether it is legitimate or otherwise. In fact, when we first see him, he's eating, I guess, lunch or breakfast at this diner. Right. And his phone goes off and he says, "Oh, I have to take this." And so he goes outside, and the cook says to the waitress, "Is he going to skip out on his bill?" And she said, "No, he left his keys right here. He's not going anywhere." Right as she's looking outside and he's driving off. And so he has a scam where he has a variety of keys in his glove compartment.
Right.
And what he'll do is leave them on the bar and say that he has to take a call, and then he'll leave without having paid for his meal.
Right.
And he tells us that he was going to do that until he ran out of keys. And so when we see him in this opening scene, it's the last set of keys that he has to leave at a bar. And so he says, "Okay, I'm not going to do this anymore." So to a certain degree, I think you could call him a con man. But he doesn't seem to be that much of a con man throughout the rest of the book. I mean, he seems to be more or less on the up and up.
Right. It's more of that happy-go-lucky, not quite an anti-hero, more of the, Robert Mitchum, Steve McQueen rebel type.
Exactly. The rebel, I think, is a good way of describing Stanley Dance. And so we see him going to meet up with a friend, a woman by the name of Betsy. And Betsy's daughter, Mercy, is a dancer at this club. Oh, God, what is the club called? The Piggy Bank Theater.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. And so this is where I think some of the mystery of Slots comes in, that's not answered in this issue, but kind of drives us into the next one or two issues, because Betsy is having a problem with someone named Les. Now, who is Les? We don't see Les in this issue, but nonetheless, in at least the middle of this issue, when Stanley goes to see Betsy, and then Betsy's daughter Mercy, who is a dancer at this club, Les is mentioned, and so he becomes this kind of shadowing presence, because Les wants to steal Mercy from the Piggy Bank Theater, and if Mercy, according to Betsy, leaves the Piggy Bank Theater, basically, that's her cash cow, right? So the people come there for Mercy, her daughter, as a dancer, and she's not going to be able to keep the bar open, she fears, if Mercy leaves. And Mercy is under threat of leaving because of this guy Les. Now, who is Les? We don't know yet. So I'm hoping that we'll find out in the second issue of Slots.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's exactly how you introduce a character like that, a little bit of foreboding without his actual presence. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I got to say that, you talking about initial reaction, or at least how I described it initially. I read this with a lot of sadness because of the timing. It's the setting, it's in Vegas. And, given what's happened in Vegas, the shooting, there's a lot of the spirit of Vegas in this story, which I'm definitely not a Vegas guy. I'm way too puritanical and prudish to be much of a Vegas guy. Uh-huh. But, I've seen enough, Rat Pack movies, that there's a romance about Vegas, mm-hmm. and the sort of try your hand and anything could happen, kind of spirit of it. That, again, very much of a, I don't know if there's a James Cain novel set in Vegas, but the sort of like, anything can go wrong, but also anything can go right for somebody. Mm-hmm. And if you're a combination of luck and charm, you can winsomely, in a sort of George Clooney Ocean's 11 way, make out big. And I think that's sort of the stakes involved with this Stanley character, who at one point in this issue is about to end his life. It looks like, is really as in a very sort of on the nose metaphor, has run out of keys in his glove box to bail him out, and mm-hmm. he's really ready to end it when he gets this call from Betsy. But the call is a call in a way back to Vegas and back to a kind of whatever that culture and place is for him. And you can see he's left it before, probably for good reason. But as soon as he gets back to it, there's a kind of, he's almost at home. There's a kind of groove that he gets into. And all of that, I think, is very much a spirit of at least the cinematic, the fictional image of what Vegas is. And that, thinking about that made me sad this week,
Yeah. I hadn't even thought about this within the context of the Las Vegas shooting.
Yeah.
I guess I'm trying to block that out.
Yeah, right. It's so horrendous to think about.
Yeah.
Let alone all the implications, right?
I said a moment ago that one of the things that kind of drives this first issue into the next one or two is the mystery behind Les. Who is this Les character? But there's another thing that I think propels us into future issues as well, and that is Stanley's relationship to his son. And we get a little glimpse. He mentions this about halfway through this first issue when he's talking with Betsy, but it's in passing, right? He mentions that he has a son.
Right.
But then at the very end, I don't want to give away any spoilers, but at the very end of this first issue, we do get a little information, with a punch, so to speak, of his son and his potential relationship with his son. And I think that's another, if we want to call it mystery or question mark, that propels us into, let's say, issues 2 and 3. Yeah. So, who is this last guy, and what is the relationship of Stanley to his son?
Yeah.
And,
I think that's one of the things that worked really well with this as a first issue is there are plenty of hooks, and a really nice pace. Even within the 30s or 20 some odd 30 pages of a first issue, there's chapters that mark out, this stage of this little beginning. Chapter 1 is called Promises, and so this story seems really well blocked out too. And I think I'd commend Mr. Panosian on really thoughtfully structuring a first issue to be really compelling. And I'm amazed how much territory we cover too, how much of sort of different high and low places in Vegas that we touch upon.
That's right.
From the fortune teller to the streets of the Strip.
And we also learned that Stanley is a former boxer, and even though he's older, he wants to take it up again.
Sure.
Yeah. So, there's a lot that's going on in this first issue. And you mentioned something about the way that Panosian structures this first issue. And I wanted to ask you a question. Now, this first issue is divided into 4 chapters.
Yeah.
Did you see the need or the use of dividing this, let's say, 30-page comic basically about 30 pages, 31 pages, 32, something like that, of story. Did you see the need to divide it into chapters?
I think it was a trick that I would throw in the same pool as as several other components of it, and so no, I didn't see a need so much as I felt like it was a handy trick. So one, a lot of stuff. I think most of all of Postman Always Rings Twice, which I remember reading at a very sort of formative age. And by the way, I talk about Robert Mitchum and so on. I'm only 36 years old, so this is all stuff that was before my time. But there was a time in my life when this stuff was totally my jam. Like this was totally my wheelhouse. Like I knew as much about Tupac as I did about Bogart movies, and so when I look at this stuff, there's a few things. There's the sort of and I'll come to the chapter breaks and the titles in a second, but there's the visual effect of having the sort of dots that these, I guess, the Ben-Day dots, or the zip tone, the screen tone effect that's supposed to give it that sort of 60s-ish or prior era nostalgia look. And then I feel like his art style, and this especially, has a little bit of that sort of Jack Davis, Will Elder, DC. It does, yeah. Style, yeah.
I hadn't thought about that until you just mentioned it.
Yeah, yeah. And then to me, those chapter breaks, as quick as they come, and just sort of like each chapter is like 3 pages. But yeah. But both the fonts and the names of them remind me a lot of something like Postman Always Rings Twice, where the chapters are super short and they're meant to be just very gripping, kind of pulpy reading. And that was the effect of those titles on me. And that's where it felt like it fit the vibe that was being created by all those things of hearkening back to that era of work, that vast era of work that I'm alluding to.
Yeah, I think you put it really well. I don't see, okay, when I look at the chapter divisions within this relatively short span of story, right? Because we have just 30 some pages, not that much, and usually if you're going to divide a narrative in terms of comics, in terms of chapters, then usually one issue is a chapter and then another issue is a second chapter, so on and so forth. Right. But within this 30-some page number one issue, Panosian, divided it into 4 different chapters. And so logistically, I'm wondering why it really doesn't serve much of a purpose. However, what you just mentioned, the way that the chapter divisions and the way that they're illustrated, right? The lettering and the images that go along with that. Yeah. Tonally, it does add quite a bit to the story. Yeah. And so in that way, I appreciate it. So logistically, it doesn't make any sense, but in terms of setting a particular feeling or tone to the story, I do think that it's quite functional.
Yeah, I agree. Whose opinion I'd really, besides obviously ours, I'd really love to hear about this, and maybe he can chime in, is Andy Wolverton, because I know he's done a lot of work with noir film and stuff like that. I wonder if he's seeing all kinds of things that I'm totally missing.
Yeah. I have to say, as an aside, I miss Andy Wolverton working with us at the Comics Alternative. So, Andy, if you're listening to this, we miss you.
We miss you. Yes.
Consider coming back and filling in a couple of times.
Yes.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, he does a lot of work with noir, and so I think this would definitely be right up his alley. Yeah,
definitely. One more thought about this. I like it. I like slots. I'm definitely going to keep reading. I do think that there's this genre, which now I think whenever you do it, there's more than a hint of nostalgia attached to it. One of the things that it always has to do in being a contemporary version of this stuff is, I don't know, like deal with the sort of masculinity in it and how that plays today, and I'm thinking of a show like Mad Men, which was very overt about, okay, we're going to, on one hand, sort of like romantically, play up the sort of fashion and the, style of that time. And at the same time, at least arch an eyebrow critically at gender politics and things like that, And I wonder so I feel like this book is doing that. I just don't know that if I can put a finger exactly on how. In other words, it's not like a make masculinity great again throwback to let's have it be this way when we thought tough guys were tough and, whatever, like
right.
there's
Because Stanley definitely does fall into that mold.
Right. Yeah. But it doesn't feel to me like, oh, let's exploit that people miss this. It feels more like tongue in cheek about that a little bit. I don't know if that's just the way I'm reading it and what it is about it. And maybe it's that sort of art style that makes that palatable for me. But I know that there's a part of me that looks at the earlier part of me that used to read a lot of this stuff with a little bit more suspicion these days, about what it was that made me so attracted to that stuff. Was it like some notion of like, oh, as a man, I can be this. But I think like, I don't have any problem watching something like Mad Men and enjoying it, or even reading something like this, because I think there's an awareness that comes into play. And I'm not sure exactly how that plays out.
Yeah, I have to tell you, it's interesting what you mentioned, but I have to say that having finished the first issue of Slots, I didn't get the sense that Panosian was romanticizing masculinity, or let's say, an older understanding of masculinity. I mean, if anything, I think that he's trying to capture a flavor of a pastime in Vegas more than anything. And,
sure.
And of course, a lot of that is structured around his protagonist, Stanley Dance.
Right.
I'd be interested in the next several issues,
right.
and then, get a better sense of, is this kind of a romanticization of manhood that we see going on here? I don't know, but I'm with you. I enjoyed this first issue, and I'm definitely going to read on.
Yeah, likewise.
So we looked at 3 really interesting titles. We started off with Tillie Walden's Spinning. After that, we looked at the 3rd issue of Love and Rockets, Volume 4, the magazine-size series. And then we wrapped up with issue number 1 of Slots by Dan Panosian. So 3 really good titles, all of which we would recommend wholeheartedly to our readers.
Yeah, it's so fun talking about this stuff.
Yes, although with this caveat, if you've never read any Love and Rockets, don't start with issue number 3 of Volume 4.
That's right. Yes. Go back and read that old stuff.
Yes, and you'll be glad you did, because you can't get any better than the Hernandez brothers.
Yes.
Yeah. And if you want to find great works by the Hernandez brothers as well as other creators, you would do well to check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com. It's a great place to pre-order your comics. Or if you want books that are already published, check out their sister company, In Stock Trades. That's instocktrades.com. And you can find a lot, I think maybe all of the Love and Rockets collections there on In Stock Trades. So whether it's In Stock Trades or Discount Comic Book Service, you can't go wrong with those guys. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up that phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Or if you prefer the fast and high-tech means of communicating us through email, you can contact the show by email at 2guys, that's TWO guys, at comicsalternative.com. Or you can get in touch with us individually. Derek's at Derek, D-E-R-E-K. Did I get that right?
Yes.
At comicsalternative.com, and I'm Paul, P-A-U-L, at comicsalternative.com.
That's right. You can also find us all over social media, such as on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, on Google Play Music, and on Spotify. But you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to the website, which is comicsalternative.com.
That's right.
Yeah, a lot of ways for people to get in touch with us.
Do reach out. We do want to hear from you.
Yeah, we do like to hear from you guys. And you send us an email. We'll read it with your approval on the show. And if you leave us a message, we will play it back. So we're all about community building.
That's right.
That's right. And Paul and I will be back with more great comics next week. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul.
We'll see you later.
Have a great week.
Yeah.